Hi again guys, and welcome to another specific vehicle breakdown and review from within the world of Gran Turismo Sport. And this particular review is kind of a little nod to today's countdown video, which was of course a patron video, a sponsored video. And this vehicle is one which I've had notorious comments and feelings about in the past on GT Sport. And the car is of course the Honda Vision Gran Turismo car, the Honda Sport VGT concept. Now, my thoughts on this car haven't actually changed from the point of view of when I said them. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that more so because, as some of you may have noticed, since discussing this car way back, I think it was in the McLaren VGT review episode, I haven't actually spoken about it at all again, really, since then. And the reason for that is quite simple, because I didn't want to make any more comments on the car, and this is always more so when it's a negative review that I have about a vehicle, until I have the chance to revisit it again, to make sure that the car is still that way and it wasn't just my feelings in the moment, or that it was skewed by personal preference. Because of course I always try to keep these reviews as objective as I possibly can. So I wanted to leave it until I actually owned the car again, because when I drove the Sports VGT, it was very early on after getting the game, basically. And I didn't own the car, I just drove it in one of the, I think it was the missions, or the license tests, in effect, something like that. One of the missions involving it anyway. And I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I found it to be far too slippery. It felt like it was just floating around all over the road, even with traction control turned on, which of course you can tell how far, or how long ago it was to have traction control on. I never do that at all now. But that was the reason why I didn't want to discuss it again, because I wanted to revisit it now that I'm used to the physics of the game, because even though I played the beta and the demo and covered both of those extensively, I knew that the actual game's differences in handling was immediately going to affect cars that I'd already driven, even, because when I played the full game, it was different. The steering and the physics were different to the previous versions of it. And that did affect my, not ability in the game, but my take on some of the vehicles, basically the way I felt about them compared to how they would have been in the demo, or especially in the beta. Now the Honda wasn't in the beta, but still the handling took quite a bit of getting used to, so I drove other cars, I did other reviews and all the other stuff that we've been doing since then, and then revisited this car by purchasing it recently. And of course it was, spoiler alert, featured in today's countdown video. And the car is one which I, as I said, wanted to revisit, and now having done so, how do I feel about it? Well, I have to say, I do feel differently. And that's why I didn't want to discuss it too much, because of course, as many of you guys have probably realised, I don't really get negative about cars that often. I might say downsides that they have, or a particular car that I don't like, maybe, as a personal preference, but I very rarely tell people not to buy something, which is why it was a big deal when I had a series dedicated to that concept. The boat series, better off avoiding these, and it's also why that series has so few episodes, because there aren't many cars which I would genuinely say are useless, and generally the ones which are duplicates, needless ones. So with that in mind, I always knew that that car, or this car, was not going to end up in that series, because it's not a pointless car. It is at the very least unique, so by definition it is worth buying for some people. However, when I revisited it, I still found of course that it has that trademark tail-happy nature with the rev-happy engine, typical Honda traits, when it comes to their sports cars at least. And now, with my experience on the game, it has changed the way I feel about the car. Now I still don't love it, but that's more so a philosophical argument, if you want to think of it that way, rather than the way it actually performs. Because, as many of you guys know, I prefer Vision GT cars that completely go pure insanity. Because otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, and of course you are fully entitled to disagree with this, that's the whole point of a personal opinion, I believe that the Vision GT program should be for the craziest cars. Because if they're not full-on crazy, why are they Vision GTs at all? Why not just make them normal concept cars? Because that's what concept cars are for. So when a company doesn't really go all in with their models, that kind of disappoints me. And although with some of them I can understand it, of course, we've discussed this before, even from a marketing point of view, it gives a nod towards their next generation, sometimes even specific models that are upcoming, which are based usually mechanically on elements of these Vision GT cars. So I don't dislike them from an engineering point of view, it's usually more so from the concept of behind the car. For instance, the Honda is basically just a sports car. Not that that's a bad thing, but I expected more, considering that their whole slogan has to do with dreaming. This isn't much of a dream car to me. It's a nice car, it's a cool concept, and of course I have no doubt that it would sell well. But it's more a personal issue that I have with it as a concept. As far as the way it actually drives though, having more experience with the game definitely improves this car, because you can simply handle it better. You can cope with the differences in steering and physics which this game has compared to Gran Turismo 6, because when you first start playing GT Sport, I'm not sure now of course because I've been playing it since release day and now we've had a couple of updates, some of which have affected the handling and physics, so I don't know what it's like coming from GT6 to this game for someone new now, but at least when I did, and when many of you guys did, it was notably different. So getting used to a car which is already challenging to drive, at least to some degree, but also on a new game, it just compounds the effect. So for me, I didn't love the car at the time, I still don't love it, but now I don't dislike it. So for me this is a vehicle now which is more neutral. As far as other people go though, and whether or not I'd recommend it, it is worth checking out. Now, I would say that the price tag is way too high for the car, but that's not really this car's fault, because that's Polyphony's fault, because they've made all of the Vision GT cars, well, the same price. So for some of them that's really good, for some of them it's an absolute steal, for others it's awful, like the Daihatsu for instance, that's ridiculous at 1 million credits, and we're also going to discuss that car down the line. But for this one, 1 million credits is definitely too much. 200 grand would be too much considering that the NSX is a far better machine, but at the same time it is worth picking up, or winning for instance. So when you do actually win it, what do you get? Well, you can see the specs in the game of course. 2 litre engine, has just over 400 horsepower, just under 300 pound-feet of torque, weighs a fraction under 900 kilos, so it's good across the board. Perfectly acceptable for a production sports car that is instantly far superior to any of the S2000s and any of the NSXs, so it has tons of potential for sure. And I also do like about this car, from a conceptual point of view, going back to what I said about thinking that this should have been just a concept and not a VGT concept, is that this is very much so a car which you could imagine seeing on the road. And if it were, it would be a car which could almost worry NSX owners, because they're paying so much for those, whereas this would be guaranteed to be a cheaper car and would still offer great performance, but in a more attainable package, which would kind of hurt the NSX. So from that point of view, you can kind of understand why they didn't produce it, because after all they do want the NSX to sell. After all, for instance, you don't see Nissan making a Silvia at the moment, because that would draw too much attention away from the GTR, and they don't want to do that. Now the horsepower per tonne, incidentally, is just under 450 on this one, which is serious sports car territory, and of course the category makes it, well, not exactly the most usable thing in the world, but if you do want to check this car out, you may enjoy it. I can't guarantee that you will, because it does have that tail-happy nature, which certainly makes it fun, but it takes a little bit more getting used to than many of the other VGTs, but in a much more sports car kind of way. In actually a very similar way, I would say, to the ISO Revolta Vision GT car. In a similar way to that, it's much more of a pure sports concept than a full-on track day toy. But that's it overall for this particular pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.